This is the concluding lecture to the class, and it's in one QuickTime movie. Well, so much of the class has been an analysis of a series of transition from Spanish and Portuguese colonial possessions to more national societies, from economies that were at first colonial and then neo-colonial, highly dependent on Europe and the United States, to more independent economies. And what this has really been about is the creation of nation states. And all these things that we're talking about were ultimately the goals of the Creole elites who had pushed for independence in the early 19th century. And so if we go way back to the beginning of the class and think about what was that Creole elite vision of what independent Latin American societies would look like. Well, economically, they thought the best case scenario is that there would be a lot of prosperity. There'd be growing economies in their minds based almost exclusively on exports. There would be, prosperous countries. And socially and culturally, they wanted to have integrated nations. Now, oftentimes that meant excluding people of color, whether it was indigenous people or mixed race people or people of African origin. But they wanted to have a kind of unified whole. And politically, what they sought above all else was stability and continuity. They weren't, at least early on, talking about democracy. They were talking about, stability and continuity. So how would they accomplish this? Well, again, if you go back to the early lectures of the class, I mentioned that that this happened through conflicts between and among the major actors in the 19th and 20th centuries. That there were the neo-colonial powers, Spain and Portugal, and later Britain and the United States, often in conflict with, and I'm not talking about wars all the time, I mean just struggles over money, over terms of trade, etc., with national elites, Creole elites who became national elites, and also new economic actors who sprang up with new activities, which were often in response to opportunities in the global trading system. And of course, there were all kinds of struggles, direct and indirect, between those national elites and sometimes the neo-colonial powers and the majority of the population, whether it was peasants or slaves or former slaves or urban workers or even the middle class. And it's, again, when I say conflict and struggle, I'm not talking about wars all the time. Sometimes it's elections. Sometimes it's strikes. But I think it's fair to say, if we look back over the entire class, that there's been more than 200 years of struggling over the meaning of liberalism. And liberalism, for the elites for a long period of time, basically meant free trade and capitalism. But for the majority, it meant citizenship. And I'm not arguing that people were openly walking around talking about citizenship, but I think that they wanted, how do we participate in the society, as something beyond dependent people, taking orders. But for most of Latin America's history, as independent Latin America, modern Latin America, most of its history, economic liberalism of free trade and capitalism was embraced to the exclusion of political liberalism. And political liberalism, democracy, participation, was often seen as something that might hurt the economic liberalism. And it's not until we get into the very latter parts of the 20th century, into the 21st century, that we see a more balance between political and economic liberalism. And I think, from my point of view, a healthier state of affairs. And we can really understand this if we periodize Latin American history. Now, periodization is a funny thing because it's imposing historical trends on dates. So you'll see that at first when I talk about the long 19th century. Now, the 19th century should really be from 1801 to 1900. But I'm talking politically, culturally, economically. It's from about 1750 to about 1880 in the case of Latin America, because this is a period when Creole elites, you can see the beginning of the period with the Bourbon and Pombaline reforms, are starting to struggle to become national elites. And as they become national elites, they're really caught between, we want to export X, Y, and Z, but we need to mobilize peasants, slaves, etc., to dig that up, grow it, whatever. So they are caught between the world economy and what's going on in their own nation. The elites are supporting free trade. They're seeking new commodities to export. They're being rewarded with high prices for these things in the international economy. And they often have conflicts with popular class groups and among themselves over, who's going to run the country on behalf of what, interest group that's exporting this, that, or the other thing. And if you think back to Bolivia, it was silver versus tin. Even in Brazil, when it's coffee that moves from Rio to Sao Paulo. But it's all this period is attempting to gain control over the nation and over the nation's population to export commodities. And in general, whether it's in 1876 in Mexico or earlier in Brazil, but roughly, the late 19th century to this endpoint of the Great Depression, 1930, this is the heyday of economic liberalism. This is when nation states are flourishing because they're really benefiting by being fulsome participants in this export economy. Capitalism is really taking off. Latin America is benefiting from the second industrial revolution. By this time, by 1888, there's no more slavery in Brazil. It ends it a little bit earlier in Cuba. It's ended much earlier elsewhere. There's free wage labor. There's the rise of a middle class. There's urbanization. And states are, robust things with powerful economies, but still very little political participation. So there's lots and lots of economic liberalism, but political liberalism is still, at best incomplete and largely non-existent. So this is what separates Latin America from Western Europe and the United States, which during this very period is witnessing, the entry of more and more people into the political system. Well, the first real challenge to this economic liberal period is the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920. But as you know, the rest of the hemisphere, rest of Latin America kind of catches up, and we have in 1930 really economic liberalism suffering. And I think I want to look at the Depression and World War II as one coherent period. And it's during this time that new political coalitions and compromises are made. There are new actors who are in politics. Now in Chile, they're directly in politics through the Popular Front. The middle class and the working class have a lot of say. In Mexico and Brazil, the working class and the peasantry, in Brazil, the working class is being tied into the state to some extent. In Mexico, the working class and the peasantry are tied into the state. And we have coalitions that are influencing macro level politics, and these coalitions come out of all the pressure on the system that was built up during the heyday of economic liberalism. So as economic liberalism, capitalism was creating a working class, a middle class, and cities, those people now want a bigger say in things. And we have a chipping away at oligarchical rule, at rule by a few. Now, some places like El Salvador, it's a horrible failure. There's a big massacre against the people who try to do that. In Argentina, in the 30s, the oligarchy pushes back, but then in the 40s, near the end of World War II, we do get the beginning of populism. In almost all of these countries, Argentina is a little bit of an exception. In the 30s, we have a rise in economic nationalism. People really want to turn a little bit more inward. They're fine with exports, but they don't want to just be exporters. And we can see that in the rise in populism. That populism is often about rewarding national manufacturers and national producers and somewhat demonizing the other group. But populism and all the other attempts to do this run headlong into yet another change. And that is the Cold War. Now, the United States comes out of really World War I as the world's most powerful nation by the 1920s. And certainly in the Western Hemisphere, the United States is dominant. But after World War II, the United States is the most powerful nation in the world. And dealing with its Latin American neighbors during the Cold War, it's got lots of issues. Now, I have that end date of 1990 because that's when we say the Cold War ended, right? With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the eventual disintegration of the Soviet Union. But in this Cold War context, we have Latin American societies with very complex social structures and economies in place, and a lot of struggle over how to govern them. And we have the rise and fall of populism at this time. Populism is an attempt to fix things without radically transforming anything, and that leads to tremendous failure. And we have reactions on the right and the left. On the left, we have the Cuban Revolution. On the right, we have authoritarian dictatorships in the Southern Cone. But we also have, during this period, everywhere, maybe with the exception of Cuba and somewhat with the exception of Mexico, it's a complicated case, but in most of Latin America, we have the development of new vocabularies of freedom. We have the rise of the new social movements. We have people looking at the dictatorship saying, we want something that is the opposite of this. And all of those ideas are starting to really develop in the 1970s and 80s. Well, as the 80s end, we have the end of the Cold War. And so it's no longer really possible, as happened in Guatemala in 1954, to tar more progressive politics as being communistic. I mean, what would be the point of calling the Brazilian Labor Party movement communistic? It makes no sense. There's no real more communism coming from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has folded. So from the end of the Cold War to the present, we've got Latin America becoming more and more democratic. And we see that there are new relationships among workers, the middle class, and elites. And those new relationships are played out in the political arena because the political arena is more open. Democracy is at the forefront of politics. But what's really interesting and what separates out this democracy from populism, other than the fact that it's very robust democracy, you don't have populist leaders, that kind of thing. Populism was during a period of economic nationalism, a turning inward. And these new democracies are very interested in promoting domestic manufacture, domestic agriculture, but not at the expense of protectionism and cutting themselves off. They're very involved in free trade. The Brazilians are among the biggest exporters in the world of manufactured goods, agricultural goods, etc. And so what we have by the late 20th century to the 21st century is a pretty good balancing of the economic and political liberalism. And where it's not always in balance or it's not working, at least there are conversations about it. And those conversations are not by guerrillas or populist leaders. They're by people in an open democratic society, whether it's through newspapers or the web or television or, in the legislature. So, it's very, very interesting that Latin America today is, Latin American societies are fully integrated into the world economy. They have vibrant export sectors and domestic manufacture and agriculture, and they are producing for domestic consumption and for export. But okay, before I get to the but. So in some ways, they have really, beyond the wildest dreams of those old Creole elites, fulfilled the promise of independence. That they're not, they are exporting, they're leading exporting countries, but they're also manufacturing things for domestic consumption. They have fully integrated economies in the world economy. They have vibrant national economies. They have integrated societies. But, here's the but by being democratic, they are socially and politically thoroughly integrated. The great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of slaves, all kinds of people of color are not only fully integrated in society, some of them are running the societies. Lula, who was the president of Brazil, followed by Dilma, they're both people of color. Lula was a working class person, Dilma a woman who was a political radical during her student days. Evo Morales, as the president of Bolivia, is a person of indigenous origin. Hugo Chavez, who's now dead, came from the lower middle class and worked his way up in the Venezuelan military. And so the very people who are running Latin American nations, who are winning elections, would frankly scare the Creole elites, if you transport them back 200 years earlier. But they're fulfilling the Creole elites' dreams of what modern independent nations of Latin America would look like or should look like.